It's great to be back in Hillsdale. I graduated from here 20 years ago, and I've been talking to some student groups today and some classes, and just visiting with some of you all, and remarking that none of the buildings that are here were here 20 years ago, except a few of them. None of the nice buildings were here, but the professors were great and the education was great, and that's why there's so many nice buildings here. So I'm on the one hand envious of the nice facilities that the students have, but I got my butt kicked here academically. And I was joking with one of the journalism classes that I was talking to today. Hillsdale was not famous when I went here. I don't think I would get in now. So I'm glad to be with you in this setting, and to be able to talk about something that I think there's a question that's kind of been hanging over this conference, that we've kind of gotten at in an indirect way, and I want to try to just get at it directly. Now, I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian or a political scientist. I'm a journalist, which is just a fancy word for a reporter, and a generalist. And so I'm going to speak as directly and as bluntly as I can about the situation as I see it. And the question that I was referring to that kind of hangs over this conference, I don't know, like a sword of Damocles or something, is, we've been talking about Christianity and America. And it seems to me that the question is, in John Adams' famous formulation, right, our system of government, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and is wholly unfit for that of any other. Well, that was clear enough in his time. Here in 2024, are we a moral and religious people? And if not, what does that say about our situation? Can we maintain our constitutional system with the kind of American nation that we have now? Unfortunately, and it's not going to be a black pill, don't worry. There's hope at the end. Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. We are not the people that Adams was referring to. We are people who are unfit for the form of government that we currently have. I've been asked to speak about Christianity in a post-liberal world, and I think it's an apt phrase, post-liberal world. We are in a post-liberal world. And what is the fate of Christianity and Christendom in a post-liberal world, and what does that mean for the American Republic? So I'm going to try to get at this, as I said, directly, and we'll leave time for you all to ask questions, and we can have a conversation about it, because there's a lot to discuss, more than we will be able to get to. So let me start with this. We are at the end of Christendom. So said Archbishop Fulton Sheen in a television address in 1974. He defined Christendom as the, quote, economic, political, and social life as inspired by Christian principles. That is ending, he said. We've seen it die. A quarter century later, St. John Paul II said, quote, even in countries evangelized many centuries ago, the reality of a Christian society, which, amid all the frailties which have always marked human life, measured itself explicitly on gospel values, is now gone. So however debatable the Archbishop's assessment was 50 years ago, or John Paul II's was in 2001, I would submit to you that it is undeniable today. Christendom is finished, it's gone. Whether we as Americans and Christians realize that or not, we have entered into a new post-Christian era in the West. And we must be honest with ourselves on this point. This change, this transformation, is not something that will be reversed in our lifetimes. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, so just sit with that. But what does it mean that America has become post-Christian. At the very least, it means this, that Christian morality will no longer shape our public life. It also means that our society will no longer confer advantages or prestige on Christians. There was a long period in our history where there was a certain social expectation that a person would be a Christian, that you would go to church, and that you would uphold and defend Christian morality. Almost an expectation. But no more. That's gone. It will actually consider Christians as unfit for positions of public trust. And as an example of this, I would give the example of our current vice president, when she was U.S. Senator, indicated this when she tried to block one of President Trump's political appointments because the appointee was a member of the Knights of Columbus and therefore affirmed Catholic teachings on abortion and gay marriage. That was enough, in the view of Kamala Harris, to render someone unfit for public office. So it's not just that Christianity will lose its influence. It will be actively persecuted. And if that's the case, what are the consequences for a civilization that was effectively created by Christianity, for a social and political order, as we've heard throughout this conference, that was formed by the union of classical philosophy and Christian theology? What sort of society is emerging here at the dawn of the post-Christian West? Let me suggest to you that it's not going to be the kind of society that we have known for most of our history. A post-Christian America will not just be hostile toward individual Christians. It will also be hostile to those ideals and principles that are derived from and are dependent on Christianity. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, consent of the governed, equality under the law, even basic human rights. None of these things will be tolerated by a post-Christian cultural and political order. They will disappear along with Christendom. They are already disappearing before our eyes. And I think that you can all think of examples just in recent years of how that's happened. And I'll suggest something that I just saw today, actually. It was a comment that the former Secretary of State John Kerry made to some sort of a UN panel that he was on, where he was talking about how difficult it was to govern in the United States anymore. And the reason it was difficult to govern, he said, is because it was difficult to create consensus around certain things. And the reason it was difficult to create consensus is because people are subject to disinformation. They don't believe what the government is telling them is the truth. And he said this is a great problem, and I'm paraphrasing him. You can all look up this clip later. He said this is a problem for us because of our First Amendment. If you think people like John Kerry or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or these other folks are going to keep the First Amendment once they have the power to get rid of it, then I would submit to you that you don't know what time it is. But what I'm saying to you, I realize is a hard thing to hear. And the truth is, most people don't realize it and they don't accept it, but it's happening all the same. So our task, as I see it, and as I will argue, is to accept that this sea change is happening in America. Indeed, that it has already happened. And secondly, to persuade others of the reality of our situation. Only once we do that can we begin to think clearly about what is to be done about it. And let me be clear, this is not a counsel of despair. I'm not here to blackpill you. But I do think that only once we accept what has happened and what our situation is, can we really begin to think clearly about what we should do and find real grounds for hope, which is to say, find real grounds for action and for how to move forward, and not console ourselves, I would say, with polite fictions about our situation. Now, there's a historical comparison that might help us wrap our minds around this that I want to talk about. Romans born in the first quarter of the 4th century would be the final pagan generation. A historian named Edward Watts recently wrote a fascinating book on this subject. And he said that the final pagan generation was, quote, born into a world in which most people believed that the pagan public religious order of the past few millennia would continue indefinitely. They were the last Romans to grow up in a world that simply could not imagine a Roman world dominated by a Christian majority. End quote. When this group, this final pagan generation, when their world collapsed, they were old men. The oldest members of the generation were born into an empire that had never had a Christian emperor and that actively suppressed Christianity and viciously persecuted Christians. These men would die in a Roman Empire that would never again be ruled by a pagan emperor and would never again publicly support the pagan sacrifices, temples, and festivals of the old Roman order. They didn't see Christendom coming. And when it came, they could not believe that it would transform their world forever and sweep away the Roman pagan order. And I would suggest to you that it behooves us to think of this generation now, not because our Christian faith is going to disappear the way the Roman paganism disappeared, but because we are at risk of making the same mistakes that the final pagan generation of Rome did, of assuming that our society and our civilization will long survive, cut off from its source, which has always been the Christian faith, alive and active among the people. And here, let me be clear, I don't mean cultural Christianity of the sort favored by the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, who recently lamented that cultural Christianity was disappearing from Britain. Maybe some of you saw this interview, I think it was with the BBC over the summer. He said that he was saddened by the empty cathedrals in Britain and that he loves to hear the old Christmas carols, which is nice. I love to hear the old Christmas carols too, and I love the old cathedrals. But unlike Richard Dawkins, who insists that it's a good thing that there are fewer believing Christians, was the phrase he used, I don't think it's a good thing there are fewer believing Christians in Britain. He thought he actually said, we want fewer believing Christians and more cultural Christians. And it did not seem to occur to him that without believing Christians to worship in the cathedrals will be empty. And eventually they'll be turned into nightclubs, or in Britain's case, mosques. He doesn't realize that if there is no one left who believes in the nativity of our Lord, then no one will sing the old Christmas carols. No, we need actual believing Christians. The French philosopher Rémi Brague wrote in the 1990s that, quote, faith produces its effects only so long as it remains faith and not calculation. We owe European civilization to people who believed in Christ, not to people who believed in Christianity. He could have been talking about Richard Dawkins there. Put more simply, you might say that we don't get to keep the culture without the cult. So as Christianity fades from our public life in the West, I would submit also to you that something else will take its place, and indeed that something else is already taking its place. I've argued in my book, Pagan America, that this new post-Christian era in the West is best understood as a repaganization. That is, paganism returning in a modern form, a kind of neo-paganism for a postmodern technological and digital age. Among other things, the return of paganism, or neo-paganism if you like, means that the post-Christian West will not be an era of secular atheistic liberalism. It will not be that. It will not be secular liberalism marked by ever-expanding personal freedom and autonomy and tolerance and a spirit of live and let live. Whatever comes at the end of Christendom, it will not be that. And this, too, is a hard thing to accept, because for generations we've been taught that secular liberalism is the natural successor to Christendom. The Enlightenment, we were told, gleaned all that it could from medieval Christianity, and shedding its superstitious beliefs in an invisible God and an enchanted cosmos, it set humanity on a course of rational progress, the goal of which was to master the natural world and overcome the frailties of human nature and create a paradise on earth. And to the extent that Jesus Christ and his gospel had a role to play in this grand endeavor, it was merely to point the way to a universal morality, one that was discoverable through human reason and achievable through rational choice and sound governance. Secularism, a concept, as it happens, that was inherited from those superstitious medieval Christians, would become the organizing principle, or one of the organizing principles, of our liberal politics. And the secular era was, of course, marked by a confidence in science and scientific materialism as our sole source of knowledge, and an insistence on a kind of Christless Christianity of the Richard Dawkins brand would be sufficient to maintain our liberal order. But it did not work out that way. What began in the 17th and 18th centuries as a project to free us from the shackles and superstitions of religion would end in the 20th century with the wholesale slaughter of millions and the creation of the most tyrannical regimes in human history, regimes that purported to be guided by these principles of science and rationality and cold hard materialism. And I know I don't need to remind this crowd of the horrors of communism and fascism and what sort of regimes those were and what they produced. I'm sure that you're all keenly aware of that. But where secular liberalism did not produce those kinds of regimes, here in the West, it would produce a liberal culture of empty consumerism and family disintegration and mass abortion and sexual confusion and anxiety and isolation and irreligion and hedonism and over-medication and despair. Liberalism, itself a product of Christian civilization, cannot and did not survive, cut off from its source. And so I would suggest that what has become obvious here at the dawn of the 21st century is that we in the West have been living off of the capital of Christendom. We've been drawing down on the deposit of our Christian civilization without replenishing it. And now the capital is gone, and there is nothing left to draw on. So no, the future of the post-Christian West will not be secular, and it will not be liberal, nor will it be purely atheist or purely materialistic or woke, at least not wholly so, even if it still is right now. Materialism and atheism and woke leftism, we can already see, fail to give mankind the spiritual sustenance that by nature he requires. They're not enough. You might call these things incomplete religions, and so they are. Having banished and supposedly superseded Christian religion, we're now finding new religions and new gods to fill the vacuum at the heart of our civilization. Everyone here is by now familiar with the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. The nuns, the rapidly growing demographic cohort that doesn't identify with any organized religion, yet whose members commonly say they are spiritual but not religious, a phrase I'm sure you've all heard. By some estimates, the nuns, this group, will become a majority in America by 2070. Now, whether or not this cohort of post-religious Americans, these nuns, realize it or not, the form that their spirituality is taking is increasingly pagan. So much so that I think it's fair to say that the future of the post-Christian West, or at least post-Christian America, will be pagan, which means it will be an era of re-enchantment and of religion, just not the sort of religion we're familiar with. I'll say that again. It's going to be an era of re-enchantment. We are entering an era of re-enchantment. Atheism and cold, hard materialism are not the future of the post-Christian West or post-Christian America. Re-enchantment in this context mostly means a dark enchantment. Most enchantments are dark, after all. It means the old gods are coming back under new names and in new forms. And of course, they never really went away. They hid themselves while we labored under the delusion that we had banished them, grown out of them, evolved to understand the world in strictly materialist and scientific terms. The old gods and the old pagan myths, we thought, were merely simple stories that humanity told itself in its childhood, just as the Christian story was a fiction that we told ourselves in our adolescence. But a fully mature civilization had no need of these things. We had seen through them and realized at last that the only true things, the only real things, were those we could measure with our instruments, the things that we could quantify. But we were wrong. And it turns out that the rationalist, materialist worldview leaves us cold and unfulfilled, just as the pursuit of wealth and material comfort has left us unsatisfied. The writer Paul Kingsnorth, which some of you may know, I was talking to a gentleman at dinner who reads Kingsnorth. He's a great writer, a convert to Orthodox Christianity. He's written recently that there is a throne at the heart of every culture, and something is going to sit on it, which is one way of saying that we desire connection to something real, and we sense on a deep level that the spiritual world is real. That's what the nuns sense. Even if they've rejected form of religion, they sense that the spiritual world is real, and so it is. It is real. That's maybe the one thing that the pagan world and Christendom have in common, is a recognition of this. But having lost our Christian faith and searching for enchantment and spiritual reality, we're walking blindly back into the pagan past. What does that mean? The pagan past, with all of its blood and fire and violence. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Before we get ahead of ourselves, what do I mean by pagan? Pagan can be a vague term. It can be a bit misleading. I do not mean that we will see a return of paganism in its purely ancient forms. Although, as I said, we will see ancient forms reappear in new guises. What are the new guises? What are the new forms? Let me mention a few of those as examples briefly, and before we get on to the next thing. One example right now is a surging interest in witchcraft among American youth. On TikTok and Instagram, it's easy to find massively popular witchcraft influencers peddling life advice, various spells and rituals, and ways to connect with spiritual beings. Now, older people, which I include myself in that group, might scoff at this, that like the pre-social media crowd might scoff at this, but you shouldn't. The degree to which social media really does influence and shape our culture can't be overstated, and so we have to take it seriously. And on social media, witchcraft today is presented, especially to young people, as a means of empowerment and identity. You might call it moral therapeutic witchcraft. And if you look for it online, I assure you, you will find it everywhere, mountains of it. This form of paganism or neo-paganism is best understood as the emergence in our time of what C.S. Lewis called the materialist magician. This is a phrase taken from the Screwtape Letters. And for those who don't know, Screwtape is a demon, and it's an epistolatory novel. It's a series of letters between Screwtape and his young acolyte Wormwood, who's been assigned to an individual the patient who he's supposed to ensnare this person and bring them to hell, right? And so the young demon Wormwood writes to Screwtape and asks whether it is essential to keep the patient, the person that Wormwood is assigned to, in ignorance of our existence. And the question, Screwtape explains, at least for the present phase of the struggle, has been answered for us by the high command. So let me just read this quote from the book. Our policy for the moment, this is Screwtape talking. Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. Of course, this has not always been so. We are really faced with a cruel dilemma. When the humans disbelieve in our existence, we lose all the pleasing results of direct terrorism, and we make no magicians. On the other hand, when they believe in us, we cannot make them materialists and skeptics. At least, not yet. I have great hopes that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science to such an extent that what is, in effect, belief in us, though not under that name, will creep in while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy, which is God in this case. The life force, the worship of sex, and some aspects of psychoanalysis may here prove useful. If once we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician, the man, not using but veritably worshiping what he vaguely calls forces, while denying the existence of spirits, then the end of the war will be in sight. It's hard to imagine a better description of what we're seeing today. We have indeed emotionalized and mythologized our science, and belief in spirits is creeping in while the human mind remains closed to belief in Jesus Christ. I'll give you another example of neo-paganism in our time, which is the shifting rhetoric around abortion. At the time of Roe v. Wade, the justification for abortion was that the unborn was just a clump of cells, and getting an abortion, ending a pregnancy, was no different than getting an appendectomy. That didn't last long. Advances in medical technology in the 80s and 90s soon rendered that justification totally untenable. It was clear that the unborn child was a unique individual, objectively, scientifically so. Yet abortion, we were told, was nevertheless an unfortunate reality of the modern world, and if we were going to allow it, it should be safe, legal, and rare in the formulation of Bill Clinton. Today, we no longer bother with these polite fictions. About 10 years ago, some of you may remember this, pro-abortion activists coined the phrase, "shout your abortion." Women were told they should not be ashamed of killing their unborn child, that abortion was a positive good, and that there should be no social taboo against it, that in fact it was something to shout from the rooftops. And given the state of medical technology today, there's no doubt about the humanity of the unborn. They are alive. They can feel pain. They can even express preferences for certain kinds of foods in utero. No one today pretends that unborn children are merely a clump of cells. Even pro-abortion activists refer to them as babies or children. Science has therefore confirmed what Christians have always believed about the unborn, that they are unique persons, children of God, created in His image. And yet our cultural consensus today is that they can be killed with impunity. According to this new pagan ethos, and that's what it is a pagan ethos, the only thing that determines whether or not an unborn child can be killed is the will of the mother. If she desires to have the baby, it's a person with rights. If she doesn't want the baby, it can be denied all rights. So for us, having fought a civil war to eradicate slavery, we've come around at last to embracing a new form of it. We believe that in order to vindicate the constitutional rights of women, an entire class of people must be denied all rights, including the most basic right to life. And I would suggest, too, that abortion today is not just a new form of slavery. And this, I'm saying, I'm not saying this is a polemic. I'm saying that this is the reasoning here is accepted on the left and the right. It doesn't matter if you're against abortion or for abortion. These are the grounds of the debate. It's not just slavery. It's a new form of human sacrifice, which has always been a feature of pagan societies. And let me just say on this point, too, that the kind of society that embraces abortion as a positive good is not the sort of society, in the end, that even a non-Christian is going to want to live in. As St. Teresa of Calcutta has said, quote, "If a mother can murder her own child in her own womb, what is left for you and me? To kill each other," end quote. Another example of neo-paganism in our time, which I'll mention very briefly, I don't want to belabor these points, but it's perhaps the most obvious example, is climate changeism, I suppose you could call it, which is simply a new form of nature worship. Like the old pagan, and maybe the most interesting feature of climate changeism as a new form of nature worship is that these neo-pagans are adamant that the public or state morality be imposed on everyone by force, which is also a consistent feature of the pagan worldview. You have to give your pinch of incense to Caesar, even if you don't believe he's a deity, right? So those are just some examples. At its most basic, we can say that paganism means not Christian or even anti-Christian. And indeed, the pagan ethos or the pagan worldview is almost a perfect inversion of the Christian worldview. So instead of a transcendent almighty God over all creation, the pagan mind posits a multitude of eminent gods populating our world in the here and now. Instead of objective morality based on the givenness of creation and a creator and a fixed moral order, the pagan ethos demands moral relativism appropriate for a world where what is right and true is contingent. And I should also say, consistent with having fickle gods that change their minds. Instead of seeing each person as a creature with inherent dignity, created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore equal by nature, the pagan believes in natural and fundamental inequality and sees no reason that the strong should not rule over and exploit the weak. The strong and the powerful, according to the pagan, are naturally superior to the weak and the powerless, and therefore it is fitting and right that they should, by nature, rule over them. In fact, the idea that the weak and the powerless count for something, that they have equal dignity with the powerful, and that their rights shouldn't be trampled by their rulers, is a uniquely Christian idea. And all you have to do is spend some time reading about social conditions in the Roman Empire to get a really, I would say, unpleasant picture of how this worked. What we would today call sex slavery was a big industry in the Roman Empire. And it's not pleasant to read about. So if you just want to take my word for it, then fine, don't read about it. And this is why, this pagan ethos I'm describing is why pagan societies, if they were advanced in the ancient world, eventually all took the form of slave empires. And this was true across vast expanses of time and geography and culture, from Egypt to Babylon to Carthage to the Vikings of Northern Europe, the Aztec and Inca empires of the Americas. The most advanced pagan cultures might have looked different in superficial ways, but they were very similar. And the more advanced they were, the more violent they were, and the more brutal they were. They were societies that were ruled by force or coercion. And here we should note, too, that it was only ever the encounter with Christendom that put an end to these pagan empires. It was not the mere passage of time. Mankind could not and did not evolve its way out of pagan slavery and sacrifice. Only Christ could show the way out. And we delude ourselves today, I think, to think that mere technological advancement or scientific knowledge will foreclose for us the kinds of pagan sacrifice and mutilation and depravity that marked the ancient world. It's coming back. It's coming back in our time, despite all of our advances in science and technology. And I'm not going to dwell on this or talk about it, but I would point you to the transgender ideology that is so prevalent today, and the kinds of things that we see, and the kinds of arguments that justify it. All of these things are coming back in our time, and we need to be prepared for them. Okay, let's take a breath. The pagan ethos I've described here will be the dominant view of the post-Christian era, will be the dominant ethos of a post-Christian society. It's a worldview that is wholly incompatible, and here maybe we kind of get to the point of something we've been circling in this conference. It's wholly incompatible with something like American constitutionalism or an American republic. And to understand why, if you're not already convinced, we have to admit, which I think some of our speakers have been reluctant to admit, understandably, but I'll go there, I'll say it. We have to admit that the American proposition that all men are created equal is not just a philosophical or political claim, but a religious one, and specifically a Christian one. And I'll even go out on a limb here and say that the American founders were not mere secularists or deists, although maybe some oddballs like Jefferson and Ben Franklin were. But in general, they believed, and the society, and this is even more important, the society in which they lived, most people believed that all men were created equal because they believed that we were all God's children, all created in his image. And our entire system of government flows from this belief, and without it, the whole system collapses. The idea that every person is in some way sacred, and I'm recalling Glenn Elmer's talk on Sunday night where he mentioned that the first draft of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, no less, his first draft didn't say that these truths were self-evident. They said that they were sacred. Sacred, created in the likeness of Almighty God. That is self-evident only to a moral conscience formed and awakened by the teachings of Christianity down the millennia, teachings that we believe came from Christ himself. So again, the American founding is not comprehensible in strictly secular rationalist terms. Our nation begins with a proposition about the nature of God and man, and everything flows from that. And on this very basic level, I would submit to you that America is a Christian nation. And without the Christian faith, alive and active among the people, there can be no American republic, because there can be no basis for the proposition at its heart that all men are created equal. That proposition, to be clear, is Christianity and everything that comes with it. Put another way, our American constitutional system isn't just a grab bag of Enlightenment tropes or a mishmash of ideas from Rousseau to Locke. It relies on its coherence. It relies for its coherence, I should say, not just on these propositions, these claims, but on a certain kind of people, the sort of people who accept the Christian claim that man bears the imago Dei, the image of God. But if that claim is discarded or denied, as it has been in our time, then whatever comes after that is not America. It might call itself America. It might even deploy the familiar vocabulary, increasingly empty in our time, of rights and liberties, but it is not America. Which is to say, we are either going to be a nation based on Christian claims about what man is and how society should be ordered in light of that, or we are going to revert to a societal state that existed before Christianity, one that is based on pagan claims about man that posits a very different vision of how a nation and how a civilization should be ordered. And let me be clear, the contest right now, despite, we talk all the time about leftism and wokeism and, atheists, right? The contest is not between secularism or atheism and Christianity, or even, woke liberalism or woke leftism and Christianity. The future of America is not atheist. Secularism itself and liberalism are both creations of Christendom, and as Christendom recedes, they will recede. The contest is between a pagan vision of the world, a re-enchanted pagan vision of the world, and a Christian vision. And the proposition at the heart of the post-Christian or neo-pagan world is that all men are not created equal. This is a proposition, not to hammer the point home, but I do want to hammer it home, that comes from an older pre-Christian order and declares that some men by nature are slaves and some are masters, and that inequality is inherent in our nature and should be reflected in our government and our laws. So where does that leave us? And at the risk of being simplistic and repeating myself, I'll put it this way: there's only one alternative to Christendom, and it is some form of a pagan political order. And this order is not based on the reality of Christ, obviously, but on the raw power, which is, now we get to what paganism is, the raw power of the devil and his fallen angels. And under its banners march the old gods, the lesser deities, and the principalities that were the original enemies of Christ and the enemies of his church since the beginning of time. In other words, the prophets of Baal weren't false because they weren't real. They were real. They were lesser spirits. They were created beings. But they were worshipped. And they did have entire empires dedicated to their service. And so we have to fight this. And to fight it in America, we have to shed the false notion, which we have embraced for too long in the West, that religion is a purely private matter, that there has to be a wall of separation between our religion and our politics. And we have to argue without apology that public life in this country should be shaped by Christian morality and ordered by its dictates, as it was for most of our civilization's history and most of our country's history. And we have to bring Christianity back into the public square and back into our politics, even if it means suffering persecution, as it almost certainly will. And we have to reject the fatuous notion that liberalism, divorced from Christianity, can sustain Western civilization. Liberalism's claims about human rights and dignity, it turns out, are empty without the religion from which they sprang. The idea that we could have the one without the other is a pernicious delusion, and the sooner we rid ourselves of it, the better. So that's the black pill part. But I'm not going to, and I didn't in the book, give a final chapter, these 10 steps to save America. It's not that simple. If we want to save our republic, we'll have to become a Christian people once again. It's as simple as that. And that will not be accomplished in the lifetimes of anyone here. It will take generations. It took generations, and it took centuries for us to get to this point. It will take generations and maybe centuries to get out. And it will take the refounding of our republic, which will first require its reconversion. And at the risk, I guess we've crossed that bridge, at the risk of sounding like a religious zealot, I'll say that the reconversion of America, the reconversion it needs, is a reconversion of the heart, but also of the mind. We have to, again, become a people who accept the claims at the heart of the Christian religion. Claims about the human person, but also about the world and the cosmos, which is to say we have to recover a sacramental view of reality, which comes into conflict with the materialist view of reality that we've kind of all inherited. We have to accept that there's an invisible spiritual world that exists alongside and penetrates the physical world and gives it shape and meaning. On a more basic level, we have to accept that angels and demons are real and that they're involved in the fate of our world and in the fate of our nations, and that what we do in this life echoes in eternity, and that, as nearly every American believed at the time of our founding, this goes directly to one of the talks that we heard yesterday, that a world of punishments or reward awaits us on the other side of death. Most Americans believed that for most of our history. And if we want to refound our republic, most Americans will have to believe that again. In a letter to Henry Salvatore in 1980, Harry Jaffa argued that, quote, "What we have forgotten is more important than anything we can now set out to learn or discover," end quote. Jaffa knew more than 4 decades ago that we were becoming untethered from a political and cultural tradition inherited from Christian Europe, which made our way of life and our form of government possible. And Jaffa might not have put it in these terms, but I will. Without a public life shaped by Christianity, there can be no American republic. If we reject our Christian heritage, our system will collapse. It is collapsing. The hard truth is that it's already happened. And in fact, it already happened. It happened before I was born, I would say. It probably happened before most people here were born. And the first step, as I said at the beginning of this talk, is to accept that. And let me say that accepting it doesn't have to be a counsel of despair. In fact, you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. You know, it's happened. It already happened. And trying to sort of, claw back and think, if we only just win the next election, if we only take control of the House, if we only get one more Supreme Court justice in there, we can turn this thing around. I think we have to get out of that way of thinking. We have to accept that this has happened and get on with the work at hand. And there's a lot of work to do. We have an entire country to convert and a republic to refound. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Don't clap too long, we won't get to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson has agreed to sign copies of his book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come, after this session in the Searle lobby. We now have time for a Q&A session. If you have a question, please make your way to a microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Thank you for your talk. I'm curious, what would you identify as like the moment or what Christians did to allow the Christian culture to be lost?
In the United States, like what was the part of our history where we lost the thread?
When did Christians like open the door to paganism coming in and taking over? Or, like when was that and what was that in your opinion?
Yeah, well, so there was no one thing or one time. I think that there was a series of upheavals in American society that set us on a course for where we are now. And I think you see it mostly in the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, World War I, the interwar period, and then World War II. This was, I think, a turning point in American history. And it was also a turning point in American government, too. I'm sure, I'm sure I'll get schooled by Hillsdale students if I start talking about this, but because I've forgotten a lot. But for example, Woodrow Wilson, for example, who's like a seminal president, who was really an enemy of the Constitution in a lot of ways and set out specifically to dismantle the Constitution. He was studying like administrative bureaucracy in Prussia in the last decade of the 19th century. So by the time he got into office, he had sort of developed a program and pursued it with a lot of tenacity to dismantle our constitutional system. And this coincided with other sort of tectonic shifts in society and a growing secularization that accompanied sort of cataclysmic shifts in the West. I think we maybe don't give enough, we don't place enough importance on World War I and the collapse of these great empires of Europe as changing Western culture in really profound ways. The Habsburg Empire, when it collapsed at the end of during World War I, had been around for 500 years, and that can be hard for Americans, I think, sometimes to sort of wrap our minds around as a force in European politics, a Catholic force for Western civilization, disappeared. And so I think I would locate it there. You could also locate it, and my concern with my book was America, not with all of Europe or all of the West. But I think you can point to the Reformation as the beginning of a lot of these shifts as well, toward a kind of secular and liberal view that sort of undermined a certain understanding of authority that has gone insane in our time. Where we've lost all sense of authority or even, I guess, moral reality. So maybe that's an unsatisfying answer to your question. But yeah, I would, for the American, in the context of America, I would point to the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and all of the upheavals that we saw.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. I was just wondering what you meant exactly by like liberalism and like what a post-liberal world would be and like when it sort of happened, because as like an economics major potentially, I'm thinking of classical liberalism, like the political philosophy with limited government, but
Yeah.
Is it a more modern sense of liberalism?
No, classical liberalism, like I said, consent of the governed, freedom of speech, basic human rights, universal suffrage, liberalism in that sense. And my argument is it's not my argument. I'm just repeating things, trying to synthesize things. But that these things come from Christianity. They don't make sense outside of the claims of Christianity. And if you discard Christianity, you can't hold on to classical liberalism. Classical liberalism relies on its source of vitality is something that it doesn't produce on its own, is one way to say it. It relies on theological claims about mankind and our relationship to God, which informs what our relationship to one another should be, and how we should organize society. And outside of that, you're left with a fundamentally pagan vision and pagan claims, which is just that if I can, my moral duty is actually to take everything your tribe has for my people, and that's virtuous and right for me to do. So I don't know if that answers your question.
We have a lot of questions, so we're going to ask for quick questions and maybe quick answers.
Quick answers, all right.
So we can keep going. We'll get student questions, and then if we have enough time, we'll do some others.
Gotcha.
Hi, Mr. Davidson. Thank you for your talk. So I never really thought about America as a pagan culture necessarily, but as you were talking about it, completely makes sense now. But I was wondering if you think we're in a maybe more dangerous place than the original pagan cultures, because we're kind of masquerading, or like we think we're so advanced with science and technology, like you were saying, that are we maybe in a more treacherous place as before, and like what can we do about that?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a bit of a vocabulary hangover. We still deploy the language, a language that we have inherited from Christianity. So we still talk about, marginalized voices and human rights and dignity of the downtrodden and things like this. And a lot of times we see the left deploying this reasoning and deploying this language, which is inherited, which is left over from Christianity. But I think this, that's empty. That's an empty form, and the actual substance of it is just sort of a might makes right, and that we are going to get rid of the vocabulary, I think, sooner than later. But I think that causes some confusion right now, and it actually puts us in danger because it helps us to kind of think that, like, oh, we're really not that bad, and we're really. The historian Tom Holland has argued in his book Dominion that all of these things that we see, the Me Too movement, and even things like gay marriage are inheritances of Christianity, and I think that's wrong. Anyway, but I have to give short answers, so that's the best I can do. Go.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering how this next step, creating this new republic, how does it not lead to a Christian theocracy? How does it not lead to a theocratic republic?
Well, maybe it will. Would that be so bad? I think what the founders envisioned was a non-sectarian republic in which the Christian religion and Christian morality would be the baseline for our civic and political life. It wasn't a theocracy, but it was. But they understood that it's not going to work. And they didn't put it this way, but this is my modern gloss on them. It's not going to work unless most people are Christian. And that the kinds of religious tolerance that we had in the early American Republic is a luxury that a Christian society can afford. But a non-Christian society can't afford it and won't tolerate it, actually. So I don't think, to the extent that there's a risk of having a theocratic republic, I'll take that bet, maybe a crude way to put it, paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln or the concerns surrounding the Civil War, we can figure that out once we've won the war.
We have time for one more question.
I was wondering what other clues there are among the youth for a rise of a pagan understanding of things. The thought that came to my mind was a cultural psychology and a way of seeing things based on categorizing different people. But are there other clues in addition to the witchcraft and potentially that idea among the youth and social media?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, there are, and I talk about some of them in the book. I'll just mention one, and then I guess we probably have to go. But one of them would be AI. And the growing prevalence of AI. And I'll give you an example. There's a company right now that has created AIs and an AI research program in which they pair an AI entity with a child that follows that child throughout their life, interacting with them, giving them advice, getting to know them, and is in some ways progressively programmed by their interaction with the child. Earlier civilizations all across the world would have understood this to be a familiar, and that this is a sort of maybe a digital or a technical manifestation of neo-paganism in our time, just to give you one example, but that we discuss others in the book.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Davidson.
Thank you.